I gotcha.
Thank you. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much. My name is Simone Domingue. I welcome you to this second webinar of the Southern Climate Impact Planning Program's Climate Justice webinar series that we're hosting with the Disaster Justice Network. For those of you who are unfamiliar, SCIPP, or the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program, is a NOAA-funded team whose mission is to assist organizations with making decisions that build resilience and reduce weather and climate impacts across the South Central United States. The Disaster Justice Network is a volunteer network, including community leaders, faith leaders, advocates, activists, practitioners, researchers, and students that emerged after Hurricane Laura and continues to work throughout Louisiana. We want to mention that we're talking about climate justice at a really important moment with so many ongoing climate emergencies and disasters, and also with the emergence of new climate-related policies. And we have a really great group of folks to talk to us here today that we can learn from, and I'm sure it's going to get all of our wheels spinning in our respective roles and organizations. For us at SCIPP, the term climate justice recognizes that those who contribute least to climate change are the ones who are left most exposed to climate hazards and effects and have the fewest resources for adaptation. This is caused by structural conditions that have extracted resources from communities, particularly communities of color and Indigenous communities. So then justice entails recognition of persistent social and racial stratification, the shoring up of community capabilities, and preventing new harm and trauma. And so we think it's really important to take deep dives into particular topics, and that's what we're really doing here today in terms of hearing about Hurricane Ida and Louisiana coastal communities. And these are communities that don't get a break and haven't had a break, that are constantly thinking and preparing for future disasters while in the midst of recovery. So we're really appreciative again for everyone for tuning in. Also, thank you all for submitting really great questions when you registered. I believe that the presentations and discussion will hit on a lot of those points of interest. If we didn't get to those questions, though, we're collecting them for future webinars and information sessions. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, and we're going to follow up with everyone with an email that includes the recording and also with some of the materials that we discussed here today. So for the agenda today, first we're going to hear from Naomi Yoder and Sheehan Moore about their work tracking pollution after Hurricane Ida. Naomi Yoder is a staff scientist at Healthy Gulf and the lead author of Murky Waters, an analysis of Hurricane Ida pollution reports. Naomi is joined by their colleague Sheehan Moore, who's a volunteer researcher with Healthy Gulf and a PhD candidate in anthropology at the SUNY Graduate Center. Then we are going to hear from Toy Jean Carter about the Louisiana Just Recovery Network. This is a co-created network that supports community rights to return, recover, and thrive in the face of climate chaos and environmental injustice. And then after these presentations, we're lucky enough to also have Dr. Alessandra Girolamo, who's going to moderate a group discussion. Dr. Girolamo is an associate professor of emergency management and director of the doctoral program at Jacksonville State University. She's also a facilitator with the Lowlander Center in coastal Louisiana. And then we'll open it up for Q&A towards the end. So I just ask that everyone please remain muted. If you have questions, though, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then at the end, utilize the raised hand function or unmute yourself when we get to the open Q&A. So with that, I will let one of the Healthy Gulf folks take it away. Not sure who's starting first.
It'll be me. Thanks, Simone, for those intros. That was great, and so good to see all y'all out here today. Thanks for taking time on a Friday afternoon. I know our Fridays are precious. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see this presentation. Could I get a thumbs up from either Simone or Naomi, who I can see? Great, thank you. Great, so as Simone said, I'm Sheehan Moore. I'm a volunteer researcher at Healthy Gulf, and I'm here with my colleague Naomi Yoder, who is a staff scientist and who was the lead researcher on this study that we're calling Murky Waters, Pollution Following Hurricane Ida. Briefly, Healthy Gulf is a network of scientists, organizers, and volunteers that collaborates with communities across all 5 Gulf states on research and tools to reverse the exploitation of the Gulf's natural resources. So today we're going to be talking about the study that we completed over this past summer with the support of the Disaster Justice Network about pollution that resulted from Hurricane Ida, and Ida came ashore last August in 2021. The full report and executive summary links are on these 2 slides, but we'll also have them up at the end, and we can drop them in the chat also so that you can peruse at your leisure. So just a quick outline, I'm going to be talking about the problems the study addressed and the methods we used to address them. Naomi and I will talk about some of the key findings together, and then I'll turn it over to them to review the recommendations that have emerged out of this for us, and to lead up the discussion about where to go from here. So in the days and weeks following Ida's landfall on August 29th last year, it became clear that many of the oil and gas related facilities in the path of the storm had received substantial damage. And so we're thinking especially about offshore rigs and platforms, pipelines, refineries, storage facilities, and other infrastructure, some just really mundane infrastructure like power lines and transformers outside people's houses in Louisiana. So we knew this damage would likely cause major spills and pollution events into the soil and the water and the air. But the problem was that in Louisiana, it's hard to find out exactly what kinds of pollution happened, when, where, and what amounts. This is largely because of poor record keeping and data stewardship by both industry and by government. By data stewardship here, we mean the way that information on pollution events is recorded, organized, and then importantly, how it's made available or not made available to the public. Because in Louisiana, there's no one central clearinghouse with this kind of information, we had to manually pull the data from pollution reports that were submitted to several different agencies, including the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, LDEQ, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the Louisiana Oil Spills Coordinator's Office, which is LOSCO, and the LOSCO reports include reports that people made to the National Response Center. So a couple different data sets. The way we obtain this information, for LDEQ, this information is available online. They have a central website where you can download pollution reports that were made to them. However, these are largely available only in the form of scanned documents. So they're PDFs, but they're kind of just like pictures of paper. You know, sometimes they even have handwriting on them. So it's not exactly data that you can easily extract and organize. You have to go in manually, line by line. And we did this ourselves, and also with the help of researchers with the Disaster Justice Network. So it's available, but data transparency and public access to this data is not exactly readily available. For the Louisiana Oil Spill Coordinator's Office, LOSCO, we had to formally submit a Freedom of Information Act to get these reports. And then the EPA data that we have was sent to us by the EPA Region 6 coordinator. And to our knowledge, this data are not publicly available otherwise. So just getting this information is time consuming and labor intensive. And then we had to combine the thousands of reports that we got, identify all manually the pollutants, the amounts of each pollutant when available, the locations, all of these, that was available, and then to eliminate duplicates that were submitted to multiple agencies. So you can see from all the reports that we had to work with, we were able to narrow that down to 254 here at the top from LDEQ, 1,956, almost 2,000 from LOSCO, and then 20 from the EPA. And these screenshots here are just little excerpts from the combined data sheet we made. You can see how frustratingly a lot of this ultimately was unassignable, the substance was unknown, the volume was unknown, a lot of question marks still even in our final data set. And these data are freely available for anyone to investigate for themselves. And for us, this final data sheet that we put together is like a very, very rough model of what agencies could be doing themselves, the kinds of things they could be putting together themselves to make this data available to the public so that volunteers and environmental groups don't have to do this, don't have to do their work for them, essentially. So our key findings, we, out of all of this work, out of all of this manually organizing the data, we started to get a picture of the specific substances that were released because of damage from IDA, the amount of these, and the locations where they took place. But because of all those question marks in the data, all of those holes and gaps and incomplete records, what became clear to us is that the data we did finally get is only just a tiny fraction of what was actually spilled after the storm. So what we'll be presenting to you here, just think of this as like one part of the picture that's in fact much larger. So how incomplete were these records? You can see on the left, these numbers here, we had, after we cut out duplicates and combined all the data, we had 2,230 total incidents. Of these pollution incidents, the large majority, 2,150, had location information. They were geolocated. And so here on this map, Naomi's done the grunt work of mapping this out onto the 25 parishes that had emergency declarations after Ida, and then also these offshore sites. You can see the offshore sites here. You can see the outlines very clearly of the lower Mississippi River here up to New Orleans, the stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge called Cancer Alley or Death Alley, down here Bayou Lafourche, and then the bayou south of Homa. And it's of all of these 2,150 incidents that we were able to map out here, only 440 actually specified what pollutant was spilled. The rest are just question marks. Something happened here. There was some kind of pollution event here related to the storm, but ultimately we can't say what it was, how much it was. So it could, the rest of these, we do have data for things like oil, ammonia, sewage, but in the end, that's only 440 incidents out of a much larger data set. Also want to note that down here south of Homa, communities affiliated with the United Homa Nation in particular received massive and extensive damage, including reports of pollution from both operating and abandoned oil wells and pipelines through the marsh. So I'm going to turn it over to Naomi to talk about the specifics of the pollutants that were released and then the next steps that we see from here.
Great, thanks so much, Jan. Yeah, so as we said before, only 440 of those total records that we have had information about which specific substance was pollution. So it already seems like I'm still impressed with the number 2,230. That sounds like a lot, seems good. Well, it just kind of it just dwindles actually, because even then, of those 440, only 150 reports specify the pollution and the pollutant and the amount, which is really what we would want if we're looking at how much pollution, what type of pollution was there and how much of it, right? So essentially we have this kind of tiny fraction of information, and it's just representative of the fraction of information that we have overall. So keep in mind that throughout, we're confident that these are underestimates. So I wanted to point out that in 54 cases, in this summary of known substances, the substance is classified as unspecified. And the reason for that is that we suspect pollution, but we don't have a clear record of exactly what it was. So an example of this could be a capsized vessel. So there's a report of a vessel. At the minimum, the vessel represents solid waste that needs to be cleaned up. But there could have also been oil, gasoline, other chemicals that have leaked. So when we talk about, when we move on to the next slide, go ahead. We're going to talk about specific totals, and those don't include those things like unspecified. So for gases, we had over 1.5 million pounds of total releases, which is about 730 tons. For liquids, 230,000 gallons of liquids, or 5,468 barrels. And for liquids, you know, the majority of those liquids is oil, liquid hydrocarbons. And then the total area, also mostly hydrocarbons, because sometimes the oil and sheens are reported as an area, an areal amount. So we just totaled up the area instead of totaling up a volume, since we don't have that information. So for those area spills, we have over 65 million meters squared coverage of oil and sheens, and that totals about 25 square miles. 25 square miles, it turns out, is the same amount of land that Louisiana loses every year. So that's sort of unfortunate, but it also just lets you know that that's a huge amount. So we can go to the next slide, thanks. Okay, so there were lots of pollution reports in indigenous communities and areas of subsistence like fishing grounds. We also see large numbers of pollution reports that occurred in the highly industrialized, pollution saturated industrial corridor on the lower Mississippi River that Sheehan mentioned before. So this map on the right shows a map of land ownership of enslavement plantations that used to make up the land ownership on both sides of the lower river. And this is a clip of the entire lower river from the Library of Congress, and it shows land ownership from Iberville Parish just below Baton Rouge all the way through St. John the Baptist. So you can see how many plantations there were. And I'm showing this because those areas have now largely become historically Black towns and communities made up of the descendants of enslaved people that now live in the shadow of toxic polluting industrial facilities. Lower income areas, and areas with higher relative percentages of populations of people of color than the surrounding parish were classified as those of environmental justice concern. And so we did a brief analysis of environmental justice and the pollution reports that we received. In this case, Hurricane Ida pollution reports occurred more often in environmental injustice communities than in whiter, more affluent ones. So there were 202 census block groups where pollution reports were located, and 70% or 141 block groups of those are of environmental justice concern for race or income or both. So these environmental injustice communities are also climate injustice communities. since the pollution from the hurricane is both environmental injustice and climate injustice. So we have an imperative as society, we believe, to tell the public what's in the air and water at the very minimum, especially in the time of a disaster when pollution is rampant. This imperative is particularly important in environmental injustice and climate injustice communities, and those areas should be prioritized. It also should not be the case that the only way that these data are available is to researchers with specialized training that spend hundreds of cumulative hours collecting and analyzing the data, which is what happened here. People deserve this basic access to the pollution data that agencies are collecting in some cases. So even though we might not have a complete picture of everything that's happening in terms of pollution, we should be able to access those reports that are being made. And that doesn't happen right now. Agencies that collect such data should also be in the business of communicating with the public and the media in a timely way, and then ultimately overseeing and enforcing the cleanup of the pollution and or holding corporations accountable for cleanup. Okay, next slide. We identified 4 areas of recommendations, and I think we have a lot of recommendations, but we distilled down into 4 areas. First, disaster justice. So some of the recommendations we found were to seamlessly fund evacuation plus recovery and rebuild and relocation as on a voluntary basis. So all of those things should be easily accessible to anyone that wants them. Government responsibility. Government agencies should require independent and regular continuous monitoring for pollution, both air, water, and waste. That data from monitoring should be made readily available. So that kind of bleeds over into the data access category here. So also improvement on pollution detection. So improvement of sensors, improvement of methods, and better coverage. So industry accountability, we would want to see meaningful consequences for violations and 0 loopholes around storms. So startup shutdown and malfunction events should not be excluded from pollution permit requirements. Also, industry should be required to remedy a problem before continuing operations or receiving a permit, and those could be some of those meaningful consequences as well. But right now, we see many industrial facilities receiving new operating permits when they're still in the process of deliberating over a violation, a significant violation, and even a fine. So that should not be allowed to occur. Air pollution prevention. I also want to just mention this really quickly, that air pollution was one of our big missing pieces in this study. So the photo shows the Norco Shell refinery just, flaring in black smoke, and it was really, really thick, smelly air. So I took this photo from an overflight, and it was, a couple of us actually got sick on the plane. It was really, really difficult. So air pollution, we could see it, we could smell it, it was everywhere, yet that was the category that we had the fewest pollution reports in our report. And that's part of why we use that EPA data set. They were all air pollution data points. So air pollution is a big missing piece in terms of monitoring in a storm and after a storm, but also how do we deal with air pollution when it's out of control like this? So really the only way to deal with air pollution is by prevention. We can't, it's very difficult to clean up air pollution. So that's the main method. So air pollution prevention should be part of a response, a just response to these disasters. So then data access, our last point, and probably like my central point, I think. You know, I said it before, but there must be better ways, you know. There have to be ways that the public without specialized training can readily access information about pollution, much less cleanup and, you know, remediation efforts that should also be happening, right? So people should be able to access what's in their air and water at a moment's notice. And so that's kind of the idea. Where that data is being collected, that data access should be there. So next slide, please. So here's the links to the report. Again, I put them in the chat. We also have a 2-page executive summary, much more digestible, but we welcome you to look at both and, you know, share with anybody you like. We also have just tons of photos from our overflights. Those are at our Flickr website, and you can find the IDA ones in particular by searching for IDA in the title. And this photo shows a big sheen coming off of a offshore rig. So that's all we have. You can go to the last slide, Sheehan. And so here's my contact information and Sheehan's contact information, you know, kind of juxtaposed with this this oil spill, chemical spill that's coming out from a facility just, you know, mired in the marsh in Lower Jefferson Parish, so kind of close to Grand Isle. And we saw, you know, just dozens of these. And, you know, there's very little likelihood that all of these spills are going to get attention and going to get cleaned up properly. So that's all we have for you. Thank you.
Thank y'all so much. Really important stuff. We have a few minutes if anybody has questions right now for Naomi and Sheehan. One question I have, what do people do that are, you know, some folks have evacuated, but others haven't, and do they have a sense, I mean, maybe they could smell what's happening, but are there emergency notifications going out to folks at all to shelter in place, or, you know, what does that look like?
Right. So for Ida, there were no shelter in place warnings, despite the fact that anybody that was still in, you know, the river parishes could smell the sulfur at least. So, you know, there's only so much you can do in terms of what to actually do with my person if there's, you know, pollution around me. But so in Lake Charles after Laura, there was a shelter in place order because of the chlorine fire, and that went on for a couple of days. And there were text alerts. I think there were like sirens, like actual sirens. And so there was a broad alert system for that, which it turns out should have been a little should have been longer. But one of the problems there is that even if you get the message to people that there's an issue with air pollution, you know, what are the options, right? In the case of Ida and Laura, people don't have power, they don't have air conditioning, so you're asking people to go inside of their home, which might not even be secure anyway because of the storm damage, and close all the windows. You know, like it's not feasible. So there also need to be better response mechanisms, like, you know, the government, the industry should be providing respirators for people, you know. That's the only way that you would be safe, right? So um, that's one solution. But essentially, like I said, prevention is the better option, because once you have the air pollution, it's really difficult to both get away from it and, you know, clean it up.
All right, well, we can go ahead and move on to Toy. Should be able to share your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you. This will take me a second to get it how I want it to look. And I might be joined by one of my colleagues here in a minute that's coming by the warehouse. So Melissa Bright, I'll introduce y'all to her if she's able to jump in and join. Yeah, so my name's Toy. I'm with Louisiana Just Recovery Network. I'm a part of a group of people that really had like a very grassroots local response to Hurricane Ida, and I'll tell you all a little bit more about that. But I want to lift up some names and some folks who aren't able to be here today, but really helped pull that grassroots response together, and who really stuck through until we became Louisiana Just Recovery Network officially. And that's Michael Esialuca, who's a colleague of Naomi's and Sheehan's at Healthy Gulf, Pastor Gregory Manning, who's a prominent leader in our local climate justice and environmental justice movement, and Ben Miller, who was pivotal in getting in and organizing crews of volunteers to help with gutting and tarping. And then there's like literally hundreds of other people that were involved. Something happened. Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's me. My Adobe Acrobat. Just sorry about that, y'all. Go back to where I want to be. I'm gonna stop share, fix that. And I'll try and multitask for a second. Of course that would happen, right? So Louisiana Just Recovery Network, before we were ever named, we were truly a grassroots network of people coming together to
And
support.
Toy, we don't see the screen. I'm not sure if.
Yeah, I'm bringing it back at the.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Zoom fails always, right? Of course. So let me go back into. So yeah, we were a part of a group of people, a large group of people who are in deep community with environmental justice leaders in Cancer Alley. And thank you, Naomi, for that overview. And people that I would say, I roughly refer to our network, not Louisiana Just Recovery Network, but our like climate justice and environmental justice kind of community as a network, because it truly is that. It's made up of people like Naomi and Sheehan, as well as nonprofits and individuals, all of whom are finding ways to like support the frontline and fence line communities in Cancer Alley. And a lot of us knew and understood that even though New Orleans was hit by Hurricane Ida, there were so many resources flowing into the city, which is awesome. And we knew our friends in the more rural parishes along the river that Naomi provided a map of were going to probably be, because of the way recovery works, it tends to be unjust, struggling for some of those resources. So how we started was by reaching out to leadership of the groups listed here. Rise St. James and Inclusive Louisiana, I just gotta go there for a second. These folks have been the leadership of these group, all Black women, have just won a David and Goliath battle. I don't know if y'all have heard it in the news, but they have Formosa Plastics air permits were removed by a Louisiana judge this week. So all of us down here are just like, I mean, it's a huge victory, and it's these folks living in St. James Parish that fought it, fought them so hard on it. So we were reaching out to them, to leaders of the Descendants Project, which really has focused on reclaiming the history of enslaved ancestors and cherishing the living descendant communities of enslaved people in Cancer Alley. And they've gotten involved in the environmental justice fight out of necessity. There's a huge grain elevator that's you know, they're fighting that could go up next to their property. Concerned citizens of, that says LA, I'm sorry. It's the Concerned Citizens of St. John Baptist Parish have been fighting the DuPont Danca plant in Reserve, Louisiana. And then Broadmoor Community Church is Pastor Manning's church, and he has a lot of affiliations, but that's kind of, I just listed that here for ease. He's involved in a lot of racial justice and climate justice work in a number of groups. So we really take to heart, you know, centering Black leadership and centering environmental justice leadership. And also there's this thing that's really wise in recovery work about just taking the lead of community members, of people who are already leaders in their community. It really streamlines disaster recovery response and can help you get stuff to people who are in the most need more quickly than going through a lot of different agencies. And we saw that firsthand. And I don't know if I'll have a chance to share any stories like that with y'all, but I can try to. So we started off by calling them, checking in, seeing what was needed, and almost the leaders of all these groups, almost all of them were displaced from their homes. Almost all of them had damage that would make it impossible for them to live in their homes for months. So we really prioritized trying to find ways to support them. So that meant gutting their homes, and it meant tarping their houses, and it still means, like, Monday I have a meeting with someone. We're trying to find funding for one of the leaders of Concerned Citizens of St. John the Baptist Parish. It's ongoing. So we just think it's very important to support them because they are doing so much. They're fighting these David and Goliath fights and holding industry accountable. And so it's important to show up in love and care for them in this time of need and distress. As part of our work, Just Recovery really does try to center climate justice and environmental justice work, which has meant a couple of different things as we've worked on the recovery process. It means we're hyper aware of the resources we're using when we're tarping someone's house, for example, and we're hyper aware of all the flaring that was happening as we were driving back and forth out to the river parishes, and we're trying to contribute our voice to the anecdotal kind of knowledge base of pollution that's the kind of rich tradition in the river parishes, to kind of let people know what's going on. There's a few other ways that we try and really center that, but we're still honestly figuring that out. How do we do the recovery work and also hold values around climate and environmental justice at the same time? It's an ongoing process. Yeah, I think I'll go to the next slide. I just did want to say one thing to kind of complement what Naomi and Sheehan were sharing, and that's that this is purely anecdotal, but as we were organizing recovery work in the fall of 2021, and there was a lot of distributions happening that the leadership from these different organizations were facilitating, and almost every weekend, sometimes 2 or 3 times a weekend, there were they couldn't do distribution work because of funerals that they were attending. So many people died. I don't know what the death rates are in that time period after the storm, but I hope that there's someone somewhere looking at these elevated pollution levels and the death rates in St. John and St. James Parish. I was stunned by the number of funerals that the leaders were attending from the groups. Non-COVID related, but even we know COVID's exacerbated by the particulate matter in the air. So, Naomi, thank you so much for sharing that map around the plantations where so much enslavement happened. This is another map that shows the different chemicals that are being produced. I think I might ask for Naomi or Sheehan to help me out here, but I think it's that are off-gassed or are that are result of different industry.
It's both like the inputs to their company to what they make, but it's usually like, what do they make at that site, right? What's an output? So all of these chemicals,
plasticizers, melamine, caustic soda. So this is what people are being exposed to, and both Simone and Naomi did such a good job of explaining how unjust, especially in terms of race, the location of plants is along the river. This is a map that shows the concentration of plants in District 5, which is primarily, or the 5th district, I'm sorry, which is primarily African American, with the lighter blue being whiter communities. So you can really see that. These are images of some of the struggles that the groups we work with. This is the Descendants Project fighting the grain elevator. This is Mr. Bobby Taylor from Concerned Citizens, who's been in the fight against DuPont for probably 5+ years now. This is Rise St. James and several members of the community on a long march up and down the river a few years ago. And I'll show a picture later of Inclusive. I'm not, in the interest of time, I won't like get too much into this, but we've had so many people and groups be a part of the work, and I just want to lift them up and celebrate them and celebrate how you can really come together in crisis. It gives me a lot of hope. There's some photographs of the different groups that were going out throughout September 2021 to gut and tarp homes. This is Michael right here, one of the founders of our group, and she was very active in bringing people down to Plaquemines Parish, which we don't talk about as much because it's very hard to support recovery there because it's that's one of the communities we worked in where the water like just washed the bayou into the whole community of Ironton, primarily African American community as well. This is a group of us supporting cleaning up the yard of a home that was needed to be fully remodeled, but we could help out with the yard. This is Inclusive Louisiana, leaders of Inclusive here, Gail LaBeouf and Ms. Barbara Washington. It's Mr. Bobby Taylor. And all these folks here are members of different EJ and CJ groups in New Orleans. Really representation from 350 there. This is supporting, that's my nephew. I love to include him. Naomi knows him. We loaded up some goods from Pastor Manning's church and brought them out to Miss Barbara and Miss Gail and supported a door-to-door distribution. This is an example of why grassroots leadership is so important in disaster recovery. You know, they were intent on doing door-to-door distributions rather than drive-up distributions, which is the kind of popular distribution model after a storm. They knew where to go, the people who wouldn't have cars and who were really in need.
To get you to the right department to help you today, we need to know a little more about who you are and why you're calling. Please say or enter the last.
Amy, I think you're.
This is a group of us working together on a larger scale distribution. They're members of the Descendants Project of Inclusive Louisiana and Concerned Citizens there. How is it doing this? Let's see. Sorry. I will. I meant to set a timer, Simone. I'm sorry I didn't do that. How am I doing on time?
You're doing good. You got 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. So when we talk about a just recovery, this is a term that I became familiar with after Hurricane Harvey. I don't know if folks on the call are also familiar with that. This idea, this framing of recovery work. To me, I can trace it to the work of Another Gulf is Possible after Hurricane Harvey, another group that I would think of as a part of this like climate justice network. There's nothing too formal, but there's so many people doing the work. And this is how they defined it. In particular, Joyisha Duda, sorry. Just recovery is a framework that resists the status quo solutions of disaster recovery, that focuses on aid, extraction, and displacement, and moves towards transformative solutions that respond, recover, and rebuild. When we say respond, what we're talking about is, it means we're talking about mutual support networks to support vulnerable communities on the ground, to meet articulated needs from leaders, I would say, of those most impacted and vulnerable, rather than a national emergency response that often marginalizes those most impacted. We've seen examples of this over and over again in our work. When we're talking about rebuild, we're talking about a long-term support to communities so that they're stronger than prior to the disaster and no longer vulnerable, rather than displacing people from their communities. And I would say the points that Naomi and Sheehan were making about making sure that exposure to pollutions, is air pollution, or all types of pollution, but in particular air, is incredibly important to that rebuild effort. You know, we don't want to just think about this in terms of residents, because the residents of Cancer Alley live in the midst of industry, and that industry was also hit by a storm. So we have to be honest and real about that and think about rebuilding in that context and recovering in that context. And so when we talk about recovering, we're talking about providing support and resources so that all people can get back into their homes and work, rather than extract cheap labor and land from impacted communities for exploitation. And how I interpret that is, you know, there's tends to be a heavy reliance on migrant workers to engage in rebuilding work after a storm. And we've seen that can be very exploitative and dangerous. And so it's important to think about the people who are doing the actual physical labor for recovery after a storm. A just recovery framework was advanced after Harvey as a way to incorporate and build upon the incredible work of so many people in communities, particularly led by women of color from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil disasters. And I would say Louisiana Just Recovery, like we've seen this time and again, like, I mean, it's just, and because we're in relationship with our friends in Cancer Alley, it feels very natural and good to center the leadership of women of color and how we design our response efforts. And then to add to this a little bit, in particular, so we have only focused, Louisiana is in our name, but we have only focused in what we call Louisiana parishes along the river. We don't have the capacity to go beyond that. And when I say capacity, I'm talking about those relationships. Like, we weren't forming new relationships to be able to do recovery work. These are relationships that existed prior to the storm, which I think is incredibly important. And just in terms of the long game for organizing around environmental justice and climate justice, like working on behalf of and in support of the people you know is a part of organizing. It's a part, caring for each other deeply is a part of organizing. And so me personally, although I see the need in other places and I have compassion for it and I do wish I had connections there, I'm going to work with the people that we know and work with their neighbors to support their neighbors and people that they refer to us, to help build in that long-term community stability and support that we all need and deserve. And so that's why when we say recovery is more than just recovering. In Cancer Alley, it means also thinking about subpar housing that's tied to the legacy of economic and racial injustice, that's literally tied to enslavement. For anybody on this call who's been through Cancer Alley, you can see the geographic, in the geography of the land, you can see in the quality of housing and in the quality of roads and in the open sewage ditches that the communities there are incredibly vibrant, versatile, and surviving in the face of like so much neglect, so much institutional and governmental and structural neglect tied directly to enslavement. Of course, in Cancer Alley, we're dealing with industrial pollution, as scientists helped us understand here. As a part of the struggle and the fight there to just kind of stay connected and to not be just completely dehumanized and what's the word I'm looking for? Dislocated. There's a real fight for historical and cultural places of significance. A lot of that centers around the cemeteries in Cancer Alley, some of which have unmarked graves in them. And we see that also in kind of the decline of churches and community spaces. Another big victory was the methanol plant that is community in St. James have been fighting for 10 years. It would have wrapped around Welcome Park, which is a community space in St. James. We see in terms of recovery that, doing recovery work in rural locations, it's challenging. It's a lot of time in the car, a lot of gas, a lot of, when communications were down after the storm, it was a lot of, maybe just driving somewhere to see what was needed. And then, of course, the high loss of life and health associated with the COVID pandemic in St. John and St. James Parish, where the particulate matter is so high, and that had an impact on the death rates of COVID. People are still deeply recovering from COVID in Cancer Alley. So our recovery work we've seen that touch all of it. And I would say, hey, sorry.
I'm about to wrap it up.
Sorry, okay. Okay, that's one of our partners. He's finishing up. Thank you. So yeah, I think a lot of recovery groups emphasize this, but there's just something so sacred and precious around supporting the leaders in Cancer Alley and their communities, and I think it's tied to the histories that Naomi talked about and that I just briefly went over. And I just want to make some space for that and make sure I honor it, because it's huge for me personally. And I think I said this already, but recovering is more than just recovering for us too. It's about this long game of really being a part of community and building community and supporting our larger network, not just in recovery from Ida, but in recovery from the larger extractive, violent consequences of the world that we live in. And I think that this is truly mutual aid. It feels really good to be able to do a little something for Ms. Sharon Levine, Ms. Barbara Washington, or Mr. Bobby Taylor, because they are really carrying the environmental justice struggle on their backs, and we're all benefiting from that. I mean, I was so proud to get to tell my nephew, who we all saw in that photograph, that that Formosa Plastics isn't going to be built. It's a victory for him. And so I'm very, very thrilled to be able to offer a little bit of support to the people who fought against that. Okay, that's it for what I had. I have photographs and I can refer back to them in the Q&A if that makes sense. How's that sound, Simone?
That sounds good. And wow, what a powerful presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Alessandra, and I just wanted to make note that there's links in the chat if you want to know more about Healthy Gulf and the Just Recovery Network. Also, there is a link to that map that showed the Mississippi River and all of the different pollutants and plants in that area. And yeah, so let's get into a bit of a group discussion. Alessandra, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, and thank you all for such wonderful presentations. It's really heartening to see so much synergy in what everybody was talking about, right, with regards to thinking about the role of community mutual aid history, thinking about the complexity of who's kind of encompassed in community. I think the first question that I wanted to ask is actually maybe going to be slightly different for both speakers. Toy, you talked a lot about sort of your reliance on existing relationships and longer term engagement and really the need to sometimes maybe even say no, right? I mean, sort of working in the spaces where you have those relationships, not necessarily trying to sort of extend out or assume that you can do the work and do it well, sort of at a much larger scale. So I'd love to ask you to talk a little bit about how you forge those relationships to begin with, right? Now that they're there and they're longstanding. And for Xian and Naomi, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about what it means to you to work in partnership with communities, because I know that you do and you do so deeply. So it would just be, I think, nice to get a little bit more of that to sort of couple with what Toy shared. And whoever wants to go first.
Do you want me to go, Naomi? And Sheehan?
Yeah, go for it, Toy.
Okay. So this is a chance to brag on our network a little bit more. So all the leaders of the groups, I personally had worked with some of them and not with some of them, but like, I think we have something pretty cool going on in New Orleans and between the area of New Orleans and Baton Rouge. I don't know if other areas have this, where there's a lot of small groups that work really hard on their and maybe have a slightly different mission and vision than other groups. And a lot of them center that environmental justice group. So I showed a picture of like people from 350 New Orleans chapter. We have the Climate Reality chapter down here. We've got, I was working more with Extinction Rebellion New Orleans. We have several nonprofits that are working on issues in Cancer Alley, and then I guess we're a small enough city that you and I would say in the city there's a lot of people that know each other, and then all those folks have in some form or another been showing up for calls to action by the environmental justice groups. So RISE had been steadily holding actions and asking people to come out to parish council meetings, and there's just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people that have shown up for those events. And so I think like when we're doing that kind of work in support of environmental justice organizing, we might not know it at that time, but it's significant in terms of community building when you show up and you make time to meet people and introduce yourself and just, pay attention to what's going on. And that ultimately, those types of things were what were the kind of lubricant for the community that came together after the storm, if that answers your question. Pastor Manning was deeply involved in planning actions. He's a co-founder of Coalition Against Death Alley. Michael is an organizer all up and down the river across southern Louisiana. So had personal relationships through their work with a lot of the leads.
No, thank you. And I think it's very powerful, that community building by showing up, right? I think that's
Alessandra, that's it. That's right.
Naomi?
Yeah, I guess our story might be a little bit different just because it's like this report and it took a while. But the way it came about was because we were talking, all of the people that are evacuated, like we're having these meetings and talking about what can we do, and people want to know. Like originally we intended to send this information out like, in late September last year. So it ended up then just getting so much bigger and so much worse than I thought. Like we were talking to the Coast Guard and we're talking to NOAA and we're talking to LOSCO, and like it took months, to get any of that information when, the Coast Guard is out there flying every day, right? Like it was odd to know that there's work happening that we can't have access to. So Healthy Gulf has also one of our roles in the community and in community work and environmental justice advocacy is providing monitoring overflights. So we don't provide the flights. Another partner of ours does that, but we go and fly and document any pollution that we see. And in the case of storms, we often fly after storms, and we will document destruction of communities that we work with closely that have asked us to. So in this case, we took many photos of Ironton, and we gave those to the community, and asked them if they wanted to, what they wanted to do with them. So we don't make those public. We just give those specifically to the people that have asked for them. Same with Grand Bayou. So, we're essentially like, doing several things at once, but it's all because we're asked by community members. That informs what we end up doing, right? So and it's so that's part of why I think, like, one of my main messages is about data access, because early on we really wanted this information, and even the briefings that the EPA was giving, that I would receive an email every week from the IDA coordinator. It was inadequate. I mean, as much respect as I have for her, like, it wasn't enough, so we see that need. We want to help communities in any way we can. We're kind of, yeah, just trying to plug in, right? And that's one of the things that we could do.
Thank you. And, I think it's such a great example with the photographs from the overflights, right? Of just having enough knowledge and relationships that you can take those resources that you have, right, and sort of expand the reach. But speaking of what you were saying with regards to data access, I think that's a nice segue to another question that I wanted to ask you. You've all talked about mutual aid, talked about all of these relationships and what people in the community are doing. But in your opinion, what is it that public serving institutions, federal agencies, local government, what is their role and what should they be doing? And again, whoever wants to start is welcome to.
Ian, maybe, do you want to take a shot at that?
Why don't you take a shot, and I'll jump in and tag on.
Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this, because on the one hand, like, so what I want is the work to get done. I want pollution to get cleaned up. I want people's lives to not be trampled by toxins and industry. I want anti-racism in all of our communities and all of our efforts. So, in some ways it's like, I don't care if it's through the government or through the industry, but it's got to come from somewhere at least. So, but that said, a lot of responsibility for especially like pollution cleanup, and like legacy wells and pipelines, leaking, those fall to the government, and essentially it becomes, our lack of agencies, lack of agency power, lack of agency decisions that then leave those things as problems, or permit the facilities in the first place, right? Or don't monitor properly. So there's all of these kind of things that I think that agencies and government could do. And at the same time, we pay the agencies, right? It's taxpayer money. So in my mind, a lot, at least cleaning up the waste and, storm destruction, prevention, I'm sorry, should be the responsibility of the companies, the industry. That should be a part of you know, a profit-making enterprise, is that you have essentially a tax, your own tax, right, on your industry. So, you know, and there are some of those things like royalties in the Gulf for offshore stuff, but it's not enough. It's nowhere near enough, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't quite follow through, right? So, and certainly onshore, we don't have that kind of an issue. We don't have that kind of any kind of buffer like that. So, you know, I think that the government agencies, though, can be a part of holding those companies accountable. That's one role of the government and of our agencies. And then the other thing that I see government doing is, you know, Coast Guard is out there flying and, you know, doing a lot of reconnaissance, and it's there. I mean, you know, we need them really desperately. It's amazing what they do. So, you know, why can't we share that information? You know, like the government agencies should be working together instead of, you know, there's something happening over here and there's something happening over here, and they don't talk and they don't relate in any way. They don't even have the same information. So that's the thing that I think is really the imperative of the government, is to like coordinate an appropriate response and, you know, publicly accessible databases.
And I'll just briefly underline Naomi's points. I thought we presented earlier this week with Brian Paros at Sierra Club out of Houston, and I think he put it so well where he said that you know, a world where we have full data transparency, everyone knows immediately and has great, immediate, clear, transparent access to this data, like that tells you, that helps people understand their exposure, but it doesn't stop the exposure. So I think like the points Naomi made and the recommendations in the report, I think really are approaching this from the perspective that good data stewardship and transparency are the absolute floor. Like they're not like the reach ask, they're like where we need to be starting off to be informing people about what they're being exposed to, but also like those are the tools people need to part of the tools that people need to stop that exposure.
Thank you. Toy?
I can probably respond like a touch to this, not in the same depth as Naomi and Sheehan, but first I want to introduce my colleague, Melissa Bright.
How you doing? How are y'all doing today?
Is a lead in Louisiana Just Recovery Network, and just was happened to coming by the warehouse to mix paint for a house we're working on, and and is able to join us. So thanks. I just recently was in a meeting with some of the leaders of the groups that we all support, and I mean, I think that more people in government agencies need to create opportunities to be in dialogue with the most impacted communities, because once you have those conversations, you're going to be in a moral dilemma personally about how you can't deny the inhumanity of living in Cancer Alley, what that means. It's undeniable. And so the responsibility, I think, for a lot of people working in government agencies might become more personal. And so I would recommend finding ways to have and create community dialogues with people who are on the front lines and the fence lines. And that might already be happening. I don't kind of track that type of thing. I know that the groups that we work with are always seeking an audience with EPA, with LDE, Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. Several of them just went to speak with the UN. They're always going to Washington, so they're constantly looking for those opportunities. So if you're work for the federal government or state government and you have an opportunity to be a part of those conversations, I would just highly encourage it. And something that might come up that I've seen and it's been kind of taught to me is that it is very clear that Cancer Alley is a sacrifice zone, because you, like Naomi said, the best way to prepare for the kinds of things that can happen if these plants are hit by storms is prevention. Because the worst case scenario, I mean, some of them have like nuclear reactors. I mean, shelter in place is not a solution. And so they're literally, truly sacrifice zones. And we see that also in the zoning that happens. Some communities are being rezoned as agricultural, industrial from agricultural residential. So if anyone has any potential to impact zoning rules and zoning laws, that's a huge role that state and federal government can help out in. And another big thing that a lot of people are trying to push for in Cancer Alley is a moratorium on any more industrial build out. So being a part of those conversations, like, it has to stop. So I would say I just wanted to kind of feed that back into this group, and a chance that somebody can hear it. Do you want to add anything?
Okay. I had one more thing to say as well about this. I think it's also the government's role to hold industry accountable for that prevention work. You know, we have so much preparation that we're encouraged to do as individuals, right? Get all of your water, get all of your canned food, you know, like, if we're supposed to do all of these things to make ourselves ready, why isn't the industry doing that? You know, like, it doesn't make any sense that it sort of becomes our problem as individuals and residents of like how to deal with, you know, this massive industrial pollution. So that should be government as well.
Thank you so much. I know it's time to move on to the audience Q&A, but I think those are 3 really important takeaways, thinking about data transparency, thinking about holding industry accountable, and thinking about having direct dialogue. And none of those are things that are easy across levels of government, across agencies. It seems like it's a big lift. Back to you, Simone.
Yes, thanks so much. So we have some time now for folks in the audience that are tuning in to pose questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand, drop something in the chat, whatever works. And I know it. Oh, there is a question in the chat. Are there any, let's see, are there any priorities either at the state or federal level that folks are focused on right now? And Hannah, please feel free to say more about your question or comment if anyone here maybe is working at the no problem, working at the federal level or state level and can maybe comment on that question.
I definitely think Naomi and Sheehan would be better suited for that.
Let's see. There are lots of policy priorities. No, that's okay. I mean, it's where to start, right? So I think that one policy priority is focusing on where, like, how to get, you know, the federal money that's sort of coming in to communities, you know, instead of large organizations that doesn't ever actually end up reaching the ground. So that's one priority, is working with federal funding agencies and how that money will be dispersed. Another federal and state policy that we're focused on in both Louisiana and Texas is carbon capture and storage. So this is a technology that is, that is supposed to siphon off carbon dioxide from industrial processes and industrial terminal or facility, and inject it underground. So thus the storage. And in fact, that process is inadequate and does not end up doing what it needs to be doing. And at the same time requires an enormous amount of pipelines, which in the Gulf South is just an extension of the environmental racism that's been here. Sorry, it's storming here. I don't know if you can hear that. Okay, good. But so anyway, carbon capture and storage is another federal and state policy priority that we're working just to expose the environmental racism and the truths about the environmental impact truths about that technology, and kind of about like, what is our future for just transition from away from fossil fuels with justice centered. What does that even look like? So I think that's wherever those discussions are happening, we're trying to be involved. And similarly for environmental justice, I think there's just a kind of ongoing discussion in many areas of policy, whether it's through rulemaking with the EPA, or commenting on specific programs, something like that. There's lots of work happening and prioritizing of environmental justice and environmental justice communities. So that, again, it's sort of similar to the money, but we're like trying to make sure that, communities that have been affected and that still suffer with, high pollution burdens and land loss, have some attention and get some justice.
I'm not as prepared to respond to that. I wish we had capacity to look at policy on the recovery side of things, but that's just, it's not in our wheelhouse right now.
Thanks so much for that. Are there any other questions from the audience? And I do want to ask folks as well, there's going to be a link in the chat, Evan or Kayla, if you don't mind dropping that in for a quick survey evaluation form for the webinar. So it should be very, very quick. If you don't mind filling that out, that would be great before we go. And a question that I have for folks, particularly really Toy and Melissa, kind of if you could tell us a little bit about the connection that people have to place and how important that is for culture and sort of the people's identity, because I think folks might hear about some of these challenges and not understand why people are continuing to live in these communities, and so I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your connection to home and how these places are still your home. Oh, you're on mute.
I was just kind of asking if Melissa wanted to respond first, so that but yeah, I can say a little bit about some of the groups we work with and some of the things I've seen, and maybe that's a question. Like, we had one of the people who supported an organization that supported our work and gave us a lot of supplies and stuff. That's exactly what she asked when she was coming into town, is why do people stay down here if it's so prone to climate disaster? And if you could get hit again by another storm this year, like, why do people stay? Why aren't people moving? And I think that's such a, having grown up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast and having lived in the South my whole life, I'm like, it's kind of a question. It doesn't even really make sense to me, honestly. Like, yeah.
I like to add that a lot of people that live in a community are elderly people, and that's basically all they know. And sometimes they don't want to step out of their comfort zone, or, I mean, it may be affordable at the time, because a lot of areas right now are very expensive. I want to say different areas, people can't even afford rent, let alone their energy bills or whatnot. So I'm thinking that's the reason why they choose to live, because that's simply all they know.
Yeah, literally, maybe everyone in their family lives there too. Like,
Yeah.
Like, where would you go if that was even an option?
If I had a choice, I would not be in Louisiana, but because my mom and my dad are here and they're elderly, and I'm like their only person to get basic things that they need, or I help them when they need help. That's the reason why I'm here.
Yeah. And I know, like, Inclusive Louisiana, who we work alongside of, who I mentioned, like, Miss Barbara Washington has explained, like, the land that was deeded to her family, they got it. I think they purchased it. I'm sorry, right after enslavement. Like, that land has been in their family for 130 years. The cemetery at the back of the property is got all of her family buried in it. From recent generations to people who they don't even know whose graves they are. And the same as the house that Melissa's picking out paint colors right now for.
Yeah,
like,
this house was built maybe late 1800s, early 1900s. The same with my parents' home. It was built 1929. So basically, it's just, I guess when you're over 70, I mean, that's basically all you know. I'm not sure. I asked my mom and my dad to move several times, and the answer I always get is, where are we gonna go? We paid for our house years ago. We have the deed to our home. They're not gonna give us what it's worth, and we can't find this again.
I guess I want to add, it's there. I think that there's, like, sense of place and identity that's wrapped up in a piece of land, in a house that is, you know, deeply important, and that can tie people to staying in the place. And also, kind of like Melissa is saying, um, you know, people should be given the opportunity to leave if they choose to, right? So, but that is not in any way feasible for so many people. If if you paid off your house in, St. James Parish, you paid it off 40 years ago. I mean, the value of that house is not going to match wherever you would move, right? And like the value now is also, so things have gotten more expensive now. So buying that same house would be more, but also where are you going to move to? Like you just said, I mean, if you move pretty much anywhere else, right? If you move to a city, it's going to be so much more expensive. And none of that is taken into account when we're talking about, what is the actual feasibility, of relocating. And I think that that needs to be a much bigger conversation that, people should be completely empowered and funded to rebuild, and people should be completely empowered and funded to move if they want to.
Yes, thanks so much, y'all, for underscoring these points, for advocating for a system where people have agency and ability to make these decisions, have that self-determination, and also for the work that y'all are doing for people that are deeply rooted to be able to stay and thrive in their communities. So with that, and if there's one last call for any questions, again, this has been recorded, so we will send up a follow-up email with the recording and a link to the pollution report and other things that were dropped into the chat. And so I know this was a deep conversation, but it's given me a lot of things to think about, and y'all's hard work is really motivating and fills me with courage, and but we all need breaks too, so I hope that everybody has a good Friday afternoon and weekend and is able to enjoy those things before getting back to it. So with that, I'll see y'all later.